This week on Quadriga, the Asian economies, matchmaking at summits. The Asia-Pacific region is on the move. 4 major international summits are being held there this month, one after the other. New alliances and agreements are being reached, some aimed at establishing strategic alternatives to the US and EU. What impact will these new alliances have on the global balance of power? Will Europe soon be sidelined in the world's most dynamic economic region? Your host this week, Peter Craven.
Yes, hello, and a very warm welcome from me to this latest edition of Quadriga, where the focus is very much on Asia and the Asia-Pacific region, this whole string of very important summits that are taking place. And we're going to be looking at the relationships in the region that are so very important. China, Japan, China, the US, China, Russia, and resulting from all that, the very dominant role of China in the region, China's aspirations. It's a fascinating subject, and to discuss it with me, I've got 3 excellent analysts with me here in the studio today. So let me, without any further ado, introduce them to you, beginning first of all with Mikko Huotari. Thank you very much for joining us, Mikko. He is the head of the Foreign Policy and Economic Relations programs at the Berlin-based Mercator Institute for China Studies. Thanks very much for coming along today, Mikko. Now, sitting to my right is Jing Möll, who studied in Beijing and Bonn. She's worked as an interpreter, a lecturer and a journalist. She is also somebody who intriguingly runs a gallery for modern Asian art and an agency providing cultural and language services. And I think, Jing, that you're going to be a very, very useful resource for our debate today. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Wonderful. And last but not least, as they say, Tom Goeller. Tom studied American history and politics in Bonn before building a career as a journalist and political analyst, specializing in, among other things, US foreign policy, which will inevitably be a very important aspect of our debate today. Tom, great to have you here too. And we're going to begin with you, Tom. We've got this whole string of summits that we're going to be focusing on. The global players who have come together there, engaging with each other. This very important region, Asia. What have your impressions been so far of what's been going on?
Actually, what we see now is kind of an end and a beginning of American politics. It is the end of a long time prepared pivot to Asia that started already with President Nixon in the 1973s or so, when he started to reconcile with China and Deng Xiaoping when they met first time. And now, after more than 30, almost 40 years, we see that both powers, actually not only countries, are going to meet on about the same level. Actually, that is what China prefers to look at. Yes, eye to eye.
That's a very interesting perspective, this broad historic perspective, Jing. What we're really seeing is we're seeing China moving ever closer to center stage. We're seeing Asia move ever closer to center stage. Why is Asia so important?
Oh, I think first of all, it's the economy. It's a big mark, and we got this crisis everywhere, and there's chances there. Everyone's going there. So it's kind of our economy balance to find here, there.
And when you talk about the economy, obviously that's very important. I'm interested in the perception of people in the Asian region. Do they now have a sense that their continent is becoming much more central in global affairs, perhaps more central than the US and Europe?
Yeah, I think so. At least the Chinese people, they are very proud of their economy and development and this idea of big power. I think they are kind of following that idea. That's why Xi Jinping is kind of rising up. Yeah.
When you talk about big power, when you talk about the Chinese president Xi Jinping, what can you tell us about the body language that we have seen in Beijing in the last couple of days? You smile as I ask.
Yeah, right. I think the person is very interesting for the world as well. Yeah, we don't know that much about him. We know the family background, and we know, kind of personal background, but we really don't know what kind of person he is. People say he's the kind of person you cannot see through. We don't know, but I'm kind of worried about this. We talk about that personal cult. Yeah. And he's now in every field of the country. It's not only in the politics, it's also in the culture, and also literature and everything. He's trying to control it. That sounds not really really democratic, let's say.
Isn't this also, or can't we see here in this aspect also another point? China always wants to copy the United States. Sometimes I use or like to use this phrase "copy and paste," you know. And the U.S. president is the world leader. Yes. I mean, from a Chinese perspective, I could understand that from this perspective, the Americans also celebrate a personal cult with their president. In a certain way, this is.
It's quite different. True. It's so totally different. Mm-hmm. I mean, in democracy, sure, we got president system in the United States. It's different as in Germany. But still, the president is only president. It's there, it's gone. And not in China. Not in China, we just chairman. It's not normal chairman Mao, but I see the chairman Xi is coming. It's not very healthy.
Let's bring in Mikko. You've just returned, I know, from Shanghai. What are your impressions as regard this notion of an emerging personality cult around Xi Jinping?
The interesting point here is, I think, that how domestic developments link up with foreign developments. So, on the one hand, you have this ongoing power struggle inside China, where Xi Jinping has been moving relatively boldly in terms of his anti-corruption campaign and consolidating powers, seeking to move other strongmen in the party to the side so that he could actually push forward with his ambitions. And this kind of developments on the domestic sides, now they are somehow interlinked with the foreign ambitions that Xi has really been carefully planning and now putting on the stage at APEC summit. So it's a two-way thing here. You have domestic consolidation and also foreign policy aspects pushing forward more strongly than ever.
It's interesting when you mention those foreign policy aspirations, those foreign policy goals that China has. I think Time magazine got it right this week. They ran a cover story about Xi Jinping and they called him Emperor Xi. And then they said, China's leader looms large at home and abroad. The important word there, the key word, is looming. Yeah, is Xi Jinping, is China looming now over its neighbours?
It is looming, but actually this headline is, for my opinion, too cheap, because sometimes they also call the Germans the Kaiser and so forth. This is a bit a cheap way of describing a person. I think Xi Jinping has really deserves also that we give him a chance because he has a very heavy burden with him. His country is one of, I think it's the only country in the world that faces this huge discrepancy in poverty and high income, or no other country has so many tycoons, to use this old Chinese word for that, than China. And you see a developing country, or you see a high industrialized country on the one hand, and on the other hand, extreme poverty, down to that you can say in that country we have a lot of slave laborers actually. So to bring this together, to make a balance with that burden, really is heavy stuff, heavy duty. and I admire him for doing that.
He is facing huge challenges. Yes. He has an awful lot of work to do. What do we know? I mean, he's also clearly a major figure already on the global stage, but I'm not sure that people around the world know enough about him. You've met him twice.
Yes,
yeah?
I do.
What can you tell us?
First, we got the impression quite an understatement man. It's not kind of person who's just speaking very loudly.
He projects a persona of being a modest leader, a man with both feet on the ground.
Yes, but I think he knows what's doing, because you say the anti-corruption movement kind of. It's not a movement for the legal system. It's it's a movement for building up kind of personal authority. So another thing is about the foreign policies. You see the neighborhood. He's trying to have back to a very good relationship to the states as equal superpower, but to the older neighborhood, the small countries, China is becoming very strong and very rude. Even very rude.
With rude, you mean aggressive, belligerent?
Yes, yes.
Mikko, let's get some more impressions about Xi Jinping himself. I mean, where's he coming from? He's a party man.
He's a party man.
So is he a man of the past or a man of the future?
Well, he's both. I mean, he looks back at the past also, and he was the person who actually brought back Mao a little bit more in the domestic discourse. So before that, everybody was talking about Deng Xiaoping as being the one who opened the country, but now she's also taking Mao again as not as a model, but as someone who has built China. So this kind of going back to history, also to finding new sources for how to govern the country, actually, with the legalist tradition in China. So this is a strong trend currently. So he's looking back, but at the same time, he's pretty clear that if it's not him who's going to push China through this period of very difficult turbulences globally and also domestically, then he has failed. So it's his personal mission to govern this country through these periods in time.
And I wonder how comfortable sort of ordinary Chinese people are with this personality cult, with the fact that he's establishing himself as a single figure in Chinese politics in the way that Deng and Mao did, and that nobody else has in that way. How comfortable are ordinary Chinese people with that?
It's very interesting. I think the old generation, they are quite satisfied. They are, again, to see the party there. The party is losing the older reputation, but suddenly is someone there who's embodied this party and says, we are doing the right things for you. And for the young people, I think it's totally different. They are not really care about politics. They just want to make money, make career in China, in foreign countries. Of course, they do enjoy the freedom now to going out in the States.
Very important.
Yeah, very important. Actually, I think the future will be changing. I don't know if Xi could control or not, because if the young people, the young generation coming back with all the foreign educations, they think differently, they do differently. Xi was once in the States for a short time, but still, he's got very typical revolutionary education with the backgrounds, with the family, and with all the histories. And he used to be in the provinces doing the local works and experienced the Cultural Revolution.
I mean, we read, and I think it is true. It's a verified fact. He lived in the backwoods essentially for many years, and he lived in a cave for 7 years.
But there everyone lives in cave. Even now.
Point taken.
Right. He's got very hard life there, and then after that, returned to Beijing. And the father sent him to the province. It's a kind of career way. You have to be in the province, and as you said, it's very difficult born to be the leader. And many scandals, many difficult things.
Let's just move forward a little bit and talk about China and its neighbours. We've talked about China's aspiration. China wants to be the dominant player in Asia, without a doubt, in the Asia-Pacific region. China wants to lead Asia. Does Asia want to be led?
I don't think so. I think even the small countries, let's say Japan,
smaller countries.
Smaller countries. Vietnam, or even Philippines. They are very proud of their own culture and tradition. Why should they be led by China? And of course, they have to do with China economically. And
However, there has been a leadership in Asia, at least since 1945, if not longer, by the United States.
Yes.
To be honest, China now kind of, wants to meet this challenge, or challenges the U.S. dominance in the Western Pacific. And from a Chinese perspective, as far as I understand it, this is just their genuine right to do that. And of course, we are now in a transition period, and if China starts not only to take over the markets of the Asian countries, but also their islands, then China is close to be, or is, a bully in that area. And the United States already reacted to that. As we all know, they started to build a naval base in Australia, and it is not accidentally that the G20 summit now also meets in Australia, and that President Obama has close talks with the Australian Prime Minister Abbott this weekend.
You've mentioned Japan. I'd like to talk about, Mikko, bring you in here. Tell us about the latest developments and what you make of them in relations between Beijing and Tokyo.
Well, since about 2 years, we had a major freeze in relations between the countries.
They weren't talking to each other.
They weren't talking to each other, which is highly significant in terms of you have a leader coming in a country and not talking to the neighbor, which is the most important economic partner. So that was a pretty difficult years, and now we have seen the first very minor steps, countries moving to each other a little bit more closely. First time you have a handshake, you have a meeting of 25 minutes at the APEC summit. So these are good signs in the sense of that we will see a little bit more a further improvement of relations, also probably coming up with mechanisms that might help to deal with the difficult situation that we have with the Senkaku and Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea. Yeah.
Is it the fact that China didn't want to talk to Japan under President Xi since he came into office in, what was it, March 2013, was that all to do with this clash of interests over the territories that you've mentioned, or is there more to it than that?
Well, there's more history to it. So the whole question that looms over this specific situation is the question how countries deal with their historic relationships. And that's one side, and then the other side is Japan is the major ally of the United States in the region. So what we see here is a broader balancing game where Japan and other countries in the region try to position themselves.
These bones of contention that go back a long way into history and a sort of parts of tradition between the country, what are the problems there?
What are the problems there? I think every Chinese, if you ask them, they will say, oh, they don't excuse themselves for what they're doing in China in the Second World War.
Yeah.
So it's a point for everyone.
And does it go back beyond that? Does it go back even further in history than that?
I think the relationship between China and Japan is so complicated because we are so connected, actually. We are relatives. Yeah, even the culture, you see the characters, you see the language, and if I were in China, I could recognize everything. I know what's here and there, although I don't speak the language. But still, it's kind of psychological complex, huh?
A point occurs to me. It's very interesting that you mention that, because obviously you live here in Germany, and you know about the fact that Germany and France, for a long time, fought many wars.
Yes.
There was an ancient enmity between the two countries. At the end of the Second World War, ordinary Germans, ordinary French people, and the governments as well, they built bridges between the two cultures. And now there's real friendship, I think it's fair to say, between the people and the countries. Yeah? Sometimes political tensions, obviously. Yeah?
We hope so for Japan.
Are those kind of things happening between Japan and China? Are there people building bridges in that way? Or are they two implacable enemies?
Think so. Yeah.
Well,
I don't
some
think so.
movements, I'd say. So you have attempts also to rewrite historical books, and but these are small communities of experts between the countries, and you have a lot of efforts also coming from the US side trying to bring in, with the model of German-French relations, in fact, to shape this kind of new processes of understanding and so on. But it's very minor. You have scholarly relations, and also in the financial and economic field, obviously, very strong linkages. And actually, these were the communities, the business communities on the Japanese side, who pushed the Japanese government to get a little bit more closer and not to let relations go down completely.
There's another very important point here. I mean, one does ask oneself, it's clearly a very important relationship because it's the world's second biggest and the world's third biggest economies. That's often mentioned. That's a very significant fact. And you wonder what the two countries have to offer each other. And certainly, I mean, Japan has heaps of green technology.
Yes.
And my word, that is something that China needs.
Yes, absolutely. However, it has been mentioned before, there is a huge psychological problem between both countries. And actually, it is history that counts. Because China, of course, was a victim. And its pride is hurt that China wasn't able to defend itself against the aggressor, against Japan. It needed the United States to get liberated. Or, I mean, I understand this going back down to Mao also as a reminder, look, there was someone who walked this long way, you know, to liberate China, and let's refer to him and his strength and his modesty and so forth. I wouldn't underestimate those signs. However, as long as both countries do not reconcile publicly, or even Japan doesn't transfer any, how would you say that, money to China to reconcile, this problem will stay as long as this psychological problem isn't solved.
Okay, that was relations between Japan and China. I think we should move on a little bit and talk about relations between perhaps the United States and China. Before we do so, we've got a short report.
Chinese President Xi Jinping was self-assured throughout his talks with U.S. President Barack Obama at the APEC summit. He envisions a future where the two nations view each other as equals. A positive side story at the APEC summit was that both countries announced an agreement to cut CO2 emissions over the next 15 years. But the US and China still have important differences, among them the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, and the question of what constitutes a balance of military power in the Pacific. In economic terms, it was a successful 2 days for the Chinese president. At the summit, China also announced a plan to boost investment in other Asian nations, and he was able to get a majority of member states to sign off on a landmark agreement that he says will bring Asia-Pacific countries closer together, an agreement that doesn't include the US.
We have talked a little bit already, obviously, about China and the US. And what we've seen in the last 24 hours or so is we've seen a breakthrough with both sides coming together to say that they will work together to tackle greenhouse gas emissions. How important is that, Mikko?
That's a pretty important development. However, we will have to see how things really develop. So this is a major diplomatic move to show that both countries, the US and China, will lead this agenda towards the Paris Agreement that we all hope for, where climate change will hopefully be tackled as a major policy issue on a global scale. And now the US has pushed China to agree to reduce greenhouse gases, to have a peak coming up in the next 10 to 15 years. So this is a major policy success also to the US side, to having China here on board. However, it's also clear that the Chinese commitment is less precise than the US commitment, and so we still have some kind of uncertainty how things are going to develop.
There are also question marks about the extent to which the Republicans back home in the US are going to go along with what has been announced there. I thought one interesting aspect of this announcement, however, was that it was the result of secret behind-the-scenes negotiation. And I thought that was encouraging, because that seemed to indicate that, yes, the US and China have a modus operandi. Yeah, they have they have a way of working with each other.
We should not underestimate the degree of relations and the degree of policy dialogue that is happening between the US and China. I think this is probably also one of the major mistakes that the Europeans are doing, that we think that US and China, because they have such big problems, they're not talking to each other, but they are, and they are trying to find solutions, in fact. And this was one case where we have seen results coming out of that.
Jing, tell us how people in China these days see Barack Obama.
Well, I think it's kind of a political partner. It's not real friendship. They're not friends, but they have to deal with this war together. And even this commitment to the emission, it's interesting to say till 2020 they will be reduce the emission, but before that it will be going high. Yeah, higher than now. So I think the Commission is one thing, commitment to the world, but also commitment to themselves. You know the problem, you know better than I now in China. They have to do it. But you are right, they talk to each other, and they talk, I think they want to share the world. Chinese will not be satisfied with the policeman role of American in the world, so they have to, but they want to just share it. So
I disagree. I don't think that from the American perspective, the Americans want to share anything.
That's true.
China wants to share, and China wants to be dealt with eye to eye. But for the United States, there is no nation on the globe that is eye to them. And if you look, I mean, if you sum up what the Americans stand for, what the United States stands for, there is no other country. This is true because China very often forgets that the United States also stands for values.
Yes.
The Chinese don't share with the United States, and this is freedom, basically freedom, democracy.
But the Americans don't stand for values in terms of Chinese relationship. That's what we are saying. So they are
actually, I see when they talk to each other, the interest of the United States is to contain China and not to bring it to the same level. And one very clever recent move by Obama was those new plans for extending visa to Chinese students.
10 years.
The students will get 5 years and tourists and businessmen 10 years.
Yes.
And this is what I call the closer they get, the more change the United States expects from that. You actually brought this aspect earlier in the discussion that let them come to the United States and they will be transformed and there won't be the same Chinese to go back.
But it's also the new announcements between the two presidents. No content, no conflict, working together. Yeah, that's interesting. That's the title.
But what you're suggesting is that there will be an inevitable slow process of the Chinese people learning to love the West somehow.
Learning to love democracy and freedom.
Learning to love democracy and freedom. Learning to love Western values. But what about the other way around? We had Mikhail Gorbachev here in Berlin only recently, and he was talking about, I mean, whether he was right and wrong, it's a different matter, but he was suggesting that a lot went wrong in relations between the West and Russia, that we provoked Russia, that we belittled Russia, that we didn't take Russia and Russia's interests seriously. Yes. The suggestion was, or might be, that we're not taking China seriously, and maybe it's one thing that we, the West, ought to be learning to do is learning to love China and establish a more constructive relationship that isn't based on, you know, sensibilities being hurt and people being humiliated, or at least having that perception.
Yes.
I think, indeed, in terms of our, at least foreign policy understanding, how we should deal with a rising China, there has been major, well, not ideological, but I think conceptual problems. So we tend to think that China is either going to integrate in exactly the system that we have currently, or they're not going to be part of it, and then we have a serious problem. But in fact, what is happening is something else. So China is building ways around the existing system and adding to the system, and so we are faced with a completely different situation that we have been expecting. So we thought China will come to play our game. If not, we will have to tackle with this issue. But we're not prepared to a situation where China is actually moving forward with its own initiatives, its own organizations even, and plans to build a regional, particular and also global order. So this kind of, we have an existing system, while at the sides of this we have another system coming up. We're not prepared for that conceptually.
I wonder what we mean by we. When you said we, the West, I really need to distinguish between...
I did the inverted commas thing.
Yeah,
I mean, we are
Europe,
sitting here in the heart of a major European capital.
Yeah. Okay. We really need to distinguish between when Gorbachev said we didn't love Russia enough, he most certainly meant the United States. And not so much Europe, because there are many Russian lovers here in Europe.
Obviously, there is the transatlantic bridge. There is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was at the core of how we responded to Russia in the last 20 years.
Certainly, the United States didn't treat Russia the way at least Mr. Putin and his followers expected. However, coming to China, I can say there is, from my perspective, no other country in the world that loves China the way the Americans do. I mean, no other country in the West, because America has very long historic traditions or relations with China, and fell in love in the 1930s. If you go back to literature and how many Americans lived in the 1930s and 40s in China, this was kind of the other side of the US. And then came the big break, the cut with Mao. And the Americans are very much interested in and kind of in love with China. However, it won't be eye to eye as long as there is this communist system. If China would transfer transfer itself to a democracy, to a free country, then China could gain what it wants so much, this eye to eye on the same level.
I think eye to eye is not a relationship of in love. If you are in love, you are not that eye to eye. So I think that's a problem, because you want someone to be very lovely, but it's not the case. If this one is not so lovely, then you got a problem. So I think this is also a problem with the European countries. We want China to be a big market for us. We want China to be a kind of friend of us. But we don't understand it. Not we, but European countries. Yes. Actually, it's not. That's the point. It's not a relationship eye to eye. That's
China's trying to tackle exactly that by proposing that the US and China should move forward with a new type of great power relations. Yes. So you have that phrase coming up over and over again. It's exactly the proposal to say we don't know what's going to happen, but we have to think about clearly. So. Meeting eye on eye is a basic precondition for that, and that's part of the program. So I think this is where we have to look for how exactly processes and kind of mechanisms between these two countries are going to evolve.
I think the most important point for me is it's really different systems. And in China, people always say that democracy is not suitable for Chinese people or for the country. Anyhow, it's two totally different systems. How could we cope with each other is the point. And in this relationship, how could you stand for your values? And sometimes people will ask if they're really a global value in the world. But still, I think we are in this world.
You sound as though you are relativizing. You sound as though there are values that are appropriate to some countries and less appropriate to other countries.
Of course. Let's say that the basic value, let's say human rights.
The United Nations Charter of Human Rights is one place that you could start. That many people, certainly here in Germany, that's the first place they would go to.
Yeah, but what's the human rights problem in China? We don't talk that lot about that. Yeah.
But don't you think this will come because the young Chinese are so fascinated by the Western economy that they actually use it? Yeah, but I think they need also to understand how this came. I don't know so far any Chinese scientist who ever won a Nobel Prize. This must make Chinese think, why do the Europeans invent new smartphones or the Americans? Why they can't. And this has something to do with freedom of thinking,
that's
freedom in science.
And young people, generally the Chinese people doesn't understand. They have no guarantee for the material life if they don't have a democracy. That's the point.
When we're talking about which direction China might go in and whether there will be a move towards Western, again I'm doing the inverted commas thing, Western values, Mikko, just give me a quick take on Russia-China relations and where they're going now, because there have been developments too there in the last several days.
Well, obviously, since the Ukraine crisis, Russia has been blocked in terms of its ability to move on the global stage, and China has really been the last resort here, coming up with major plans in energy cooperation and financial cooperation and also trade. So China-Russia relations have improved substantially in the last months, over the last year basically. And while this is a major trend, I don't think that the Chinese side is all too happy about the whole setup, also particularly with regard to the Ukraine crisis. It's a very complicated relationship also. If you look at the long-term trend, there will be major struggles also with regard to the question how Central Asia needs to be organized, and also in strategic terms, whether Russia is really a trustworthy partner is a question that the Chinese pose themselves, as we do.
It's interesting because, I mean, there have been phases in the past where China and Russia have moved closer together, but they've always proved sort of uncomfortable bedfellows. They've never properly got on with each other, never trusted each other.
No, it's the history. I mean, since Mao didn't trust Russian. Was open say that, but now I think the Chinese government have to have a kind of balance there against the world, and Russia is directly neighbor. So,
As a good partner for many projects currently, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Also, and Central Asia is a major part of Chinese foreign policy strategy currently, so they need Russia to come on board.
Especially with this Silk Road project.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yes.
Just explain what that is for our viewers a little bit.
The Silk Road project, there's one on the maritime side going through Southeast Asia, and the other one on the land side going up to Europe, basically. And it's been one of the core projects of foreign policy under Xi Jinping, trying to link these countries and trying to find new ways of transport infrastructure going through the continents. And just recently, China has set up a new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and also a Silk Road Fund, which is equipped with a lot of money, and they're going to 40 billion for the Silk Road Fund, 50 billion for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and they're all focusing on particularly these issues that they need to tackle. That is to build roads, to build railway linkages and other kinds of linkages in the region. So it's a pretty comprehensive approach now. So you have foreign policy ambitions merging with these kinds of new financial institutions coming up.
It occurred to me that Mongolia is not in the APEC, isn't it? I don't think so, because it's interesting. It's a country just between, and all the Western countries now coming to Mongolia for financial or for investment interests, but we don't talk about that.
I would like to throw in another point, because I feel not comfortable with this China bashing that happens so often in Europe. It is never said that what great development China went through. Let us remember in the 1960s and 70s, this country faced a lot of poverty and flooding, and people were extremely poor, and hunger was widespread and so forth. China overcame this. Nobody says today this is great. You have had a perfect transition. Or all Western countries have been on war since 1945, and the last time we have seen Chinese troops fighting was in 1953 in the Korean War, and never since then. So China is not really in the military aspect.
Well,
yes, but we haven't seen China in any kind of major wars or threatening other countries with its army. It's still in a building process. It's still a people's army, as they say. We don't know how China will use his army, but so far we have to be also fair. If we judge China and say China is going to be a bully in the region, actually, one could say the United States is a bully in the area and always or never has military options off the table.
You have a lot of dissident contacts here in Germany. Yes, a lot of people who you know personally. Yes. What people in the dissident community here in Germany, what would they just say about this? Saying that we have to have understanding for China, that it's been a very tough century for China, and it's not easy to be a Western-style democracy. Too many problems.
We are not saying that China will be bullying the world. You are right. China concentrates in this big area of their own problems, and all the friends who are not allowed to live in China and live in Germany or Western countries, they are worrying about the situation now in China, because they recognize the situation, of course, the poverty, and you said the situation in the 60s, and it's kind of a result of the Cultural Revolution. You should recognize that as well. And people, and they are worrying about the Xi Jinping has been making a more closer politic to the political dissident or political. There's really no freedom of speeches or kind of. Even the people who's got a block will be put in prison.
Go on, Mikko.
I think we should really stop waiting for China to become like us or Western countries. This is a basic misconception. I think not in terms of political development, in terms of economic development, China is not going to be like we want them to be, maybe. So we should try to find ways how to link up with the country despite our criticisms.
Let me just interrupt you just for a second, because the argument that is made is that China is investing hugely abroad. We've had the point that many middle-class Chinese are sending their kids now to US colleges and to schools abroad. Even Xi Jinping sent his daughter to Harvard. Yes. Xi Jinping has been saying that in the next, I think, 5 years, he said 500 million Chinese tourists are going to travel abroad. So that does seem to indicate that China is going to see the West and possibly want more of it.
Well, I think there are structural barriers to that. One is the Chinese Communist Party, obviously, and they're not going to play the role that merely acting as a government in the Western countries. So, and others are that we have a country on a continental scale that can simply not behave like Switzerland. So, in terms of economic development, they will have to find ways also to integrate countries in the region and to find ways how to develop the West. And this is a long period of time that we will have to be patient on the one side, but on the other hand, we have also to make clear what we expect and in which.
What do we expect? That's the point. Because we say China is a global player now. Nobody doubt about that. But still, what kind of global player? We want the same value, playing the same game, or we just playing the same game without any standing value?
Mm-hmm. And what is the right position? If you were talking to Angela Merkel now, what would you say? What would your advice to Angela Merkel be for her future China policy?
German is kind of now very quiet about the political things. They even don't talk about Tibet things or when Dalai Lama comes.
Partly that is because it doesn't work. Because what we always see is we see Western leaders going to China and saying human rights, and then they go away. And really, they've only done it for the Western media.
They don't need to speak out there, but they have to show there's point of stand. They have to say, we don't think it's right. That's
I've just been looking at the clock. We're beginning to run out of time, and I'd like to how shall I put it? Crystal ball time before we finish. The 21st century is still quite a young century. What do you say? Is it going to be the American century, a Chinese century, an Asian Pacific century, or something completely different again?
To me personally, I think it's going to be an Asian Pacific century, and the European side really has to tackle with this issue and find ways how to engage in these dynamic drivers of growth and development.
Tom is nodding.
No, I'm disagreeing.
He's nodding in disagreement.
Yeah, right, correct. I say it's going still to stay an American century as it had been in the past.
Okay.
I agree with Mikko.
Okay, thank you very, very much, all three of you, Mikko, Tom and Jing, for joining me today. Fascinating discussion. I hope we've given you at home plenty of food for thought. Come back next week for another edition of Quadriga. Bye-bye and tschüss from me.